Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes to allow a few more people to log in. And we'll just start at around like 1 minute past 3, maybe 2 minutes. So if you just stay a bit patient with us, we don't want anyone to lose out on what I think will be quite a fun conversation. Okay, I think this is a good time for us to start. Welcome, everyone. This is quite a fantastic turnout for what I think will be a really interesting conversation this afternoon. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's logged on. It shows your interest in this topic. It shows your interest in issues around transparency in the country, and it also shows that there's people who are passionate about this country. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending. My name is Rikhotso Fetsi Chigani. I am the Deputy Chairperson of Defend Our Democracy. And today we'll be having a conversation about Phala Phala, but more importantly about what are the questions, the very critical questions that still need to be answered around this entire saga, and really helping us understand the intricacies of this. For some people, we have multiple reports, right? There's one report after another report. All of them seem to be pointing in one direction, but all of them leaving us unsatisfied. And a lot of that comes to a lack of the understanding about what does transparency mean in the country? What does it mean to hold officials accountable, especially when your gut tells you that maybe there is something wrong here, and usually people like listening to their gut. So we're going to be unpacking the Phala Phala saga across all the reports. In the main, the last report that was issued by the South African Reserve Bank. And today with me, we have Mr. Khaya Sithole, who's graciously decided to join us today, which I'm always appreciative of. For those who don't know, Khaya Sithole is a fantastic public commentator. If you don't follow him on Twitter, you should follow him today. He is a chartered accountant, an academic, and an activist, as well as a writer and a radio host. He's graduated from UKZN in Oxford, and his work in the media arena includes political and economic commentary, corporate events facilitation, and he's also the host of a show on Power FM. Khaya is a regular contributor on politics and finance for ENCA, Open News, and the SABC, and writes various columns for the Business Day, Mail and Guardian, and Financial 24, Fin24 for short. He served on numerous different boards. He's chaired audit committees, and he currently serves on the boards of Lefika Laporto, the Art Therapy Institute, where he serves as the board chairperson, the board of the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, and Financial Sector Transformation Council as the board chairperson. I've known Khaya for what, 4 or 5 years at this point? And I find all our conversations quite invigorating, and I'm curious to see how this one's going to go as well. Unfortunately, Farrell Hafaji was unable to join us today for unforeseen circumstances, but she sends her well wishes for this conversation. I know she wanted to be here, and we'll definitely have her for the next round of conversations. For those, there are people who will be trying to get on. If you get kicked off and the room then becomes full, please note that this is also being live streamed on YouTube. So that is more than available for you to go there as well. Please also note that we'll be taking all the questions through the chat, right? So if you put in the chat what your question is, I'll be able to see it. Our team in the background will be telling us, or at least feeding the questions back to me. And that's how we're going to kind of handle the question and answers. Otherwise, it could get quite unwieldy, and we really want to have as much participation as possible. So I mean, that is enough of the introductions. I hope that was clear enough for all those in the room right now. So like I said, the Phala Phala saga, which really kicked off around June of last year, if I'm not mistaken, when a case was opened up against the president, which at the time might have seemed quite innocuous, but as the story has unfolded, people have started asking questions about how is it possible to have such large amounts of foreign currency sitting under a couch, right? And what's the process of getting that foreign currency into the country? And what was it made for? I mean, not what was it made for, but what was it supposed to be used for? Is there any receipts of the transaction? And obviously this escalated with the African Transformation Movement, ATM, opening up essentially an investigation within Parliament, asking these questions. And Parliament's report essentially said, where they smoke, there should be fire. That's probably the best way to summarize that report. And in Parliament, it was voted down as this idea of removing the president based off that report. But the case sparked numerous questions from multiple government agencies who've then all gone about the business of investigating what happened over that Christmas period in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So as I've said, I'm here with Kaya Sitolo, who's going to be helping us unpack this a bit more. And Kaya, you know, someone once said to me, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. Someone said to me, you know, the problem in South Africa is that they don't realize that there's people who are very rich. People who are very rich, where having $500,000 in cash is actually not a big deal. And I thought to myself, well, I'm definitely not that rich. So I have no idea to relate to that. But is it a normal thing in our country for an individual to have that large amount of foreign currency sitting in your property or within your property for the use of buying any particular good? Just so we have a baseline understanding of, like, you know, what are we really talking about? Because we could talk about the security forces and going to Namibia and press statements and all of that. But let's kind of start off there and your thoughts around that topic, and we'll kind of lead from there.
Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone. The simple answer is no, it cannot be normal simply because it is illegal. What we have is obviously a very important legal system that requires us to say, there is an agency that is responsible for the custody of the country's financial system, that of the Reserve Bank in particular. It's got particular support agencies like the Financial Intelligence Center and all of those that also deal with other parts of the ecosystem. One of the more important things is that we obviously also specifically need to know how much currency of a particular type circulates in the country or in the economy at any point in time. And that simply means that there are particularly strict laws that govern the movement and the exchange of foreign currency within South Africa's borders. And the primary focus is to simply say that the country needs to know. So the most important thing is that somebody needs to know. So what that will mean is that if you are coming into the country with foreign currency, you need to declare it. We're not going to prescribe to you what to do with it, but we simply need to know. So there's a declaration process when you come in, and there's a declaration process when you exit. That's the first part. The secondary part is that it becomes very difficult to then imagine what type of reasonable justification anyone could advance for saying, I do want to retain 500,000 US dollars in hard currency in my car or in my safe or in my or in my couch, for example, because surely the banking system is a much safer option. And there isn't really much that one can explain as a basis for saying, I want to keep it in-house. Now, that is obviously different for people who engage in transactions that are legitimate. So if you do run a particular business and that business is known to be a hard currency-based business, a foreign currency-based business, that is fine, provided then you then follow the rules and the laws around the declaration of that money and the declaration of those particular transactions. We also do know that sectors where people of a particular economic profile tend to transact, whether it's game farm or, you know, any fancy things like that, they do have a predilection for trading in foreign currency. Again, as long as it is declared and as long as it within, you know, defined parameters, it is not on its own illegal. What we're dealing with here is simply the question of whether this particular business and this particular transaction essentially met all of those dimensions and essentially remained within the ambit of the law. And that's where the type of confusions and, you know, the gray lines have become quite clear ever since the story was accidentally discovered in the middle of last year.
I mean, I want to push you a bit on that. So, like I said at the beginning, where they smoke, there seems to be fire. And where it seems to be pointing is that a lot of these reports are saying, yes, there's definitely some sort of smoke, but we're not sure if there's an actual fire yet, right? And these reports are essentially saying, taking the responsibility and putting it at other people's shoulders, and essentially saying we are quite limited in what we can investigate, we're quite limited in what we can do and what we can infer from these findings, and we've now covered ourselves in our corner. And it poses this question about what are the accountability processes and the powers of such institutions where everyone in the country has this broad understanding that, as you've just explained, that amount of money in hard cash as a foreign currency is not a normal thing. And therefore, if it is not a normal thing, there must be some sort of legal ramifications. Otherwise, all of us would be running around with hard currency and that amount of cash. So it speaks volumes about our institutions. I mean, can you walk us through, the processes, especially that SARS and the SRB kind of followed, and where their potential blind spots are and the limitations that they had? And then we can talk about whether there's an actual fire.
The simple blind spot is the inconsistent and perhaps irregular development of legislation around these particular issues. So if you look, for example, the type of law that SARB had to, the Reserve Bank had to deal with, it's a law that was written in 1961. We do know that SARS regularly updates its laws, so its laws are far more recent than what you would have seen in 1961. What would have happened with the Hawks looking at this, they would have looked at parameters that when we wrote them and when we designed them, we didn't essentially put together a spectrum of transactions and say, look, if these are the type of transactions that we think are emerging in this sector, where do the accountability mechanisms intersect? And when they intersect, do they speak to each other? Do they converge towards, reasonable conclusions? Or are they designed in a way that actually leaves us in limbo? That's the crux of the problem here. So if we just look at the Customs and Excise Control Act that the South African Revenue Service would look at, that is obviously very responsive to changes in the way people do businesses. So obviously what used to be the law back in the 60s versus what the practices are in the 70s or in the 80s has changed sufficiently enough for them to say we need to keep updating the law. We've got new ports of entry, for example, so that's a far more responsive act, for example. When you look at what the Reserve Bank has been working with, it's been working with a template that was written in 1961. And you can imagine how much and so many things that have changed since then. So in 1961, perhaps the only way in which you could get $10 into the country was to have it as a currency transaction declared at a point of entry, because we had limited points of entry. We had limited licensees who held the license to actually convert foreign currency. Clearly, the financial ecosystem these days is far more sophisticated than it was back then. Similarly, when you talk about the question of what the public protector looked like, again, I don't think when we were developing the Executive Ethics Act, somebody said, look, let us go and look at the country's money exchange laws and all of that and use that as a prism for developing that law. That clearly did not happen. So what you've ended up with is a series of laws that are all equally responsible for some parts of this conversation, but there isn't a singular legal reference that has the capacity to interrogate every single aspect of the transaction. So if we are to understand how a transaction of this nature happens, in that the currency has to come into the country first and foremost. At the point of entry, the three most important organizations would be the Department of Home Affairs, there would have been SARS, and there would have been the police. So if I came in and I had undeclared currency, for example, well, then Home Affairs would take an interest in that, and Home Affairs would call SARS and say, look, here's what he has, has he declared it duly? And if he hasn't, then the police service would have said, hold on, we've got a conversation to have. The fundamental problem, and I did an article about this about 2 weeks ago, is that the greatest limitation with all of these particular transactions is that they form part of what is really a quasi-parallel economy. Why we call it a quasi-parallel economy is that it's not a formal economy, but if people want to move money in and out of the country, they are less likely to declare it if they don't want to be, caught in the system. So what the system relies on is really accidental disclosures. Whistleblowers play a critical role in alerting the law enforcement agencies that somebody is moving cash in and out of the country illegally. So in one famous case that happened in 2018, there was a lady who had $630,700 in her backpack, and she was about to board a flight to Hong Kong. And she went through the customs. She was actually seated on the plane by the time the police and SARS walked in. And the reason they walked in is that SARS has a series of informers across the country who then decided, one of the informers decided to actually alert SARS that, oh, by the way, one of the mules, or what you call them, the money movers, she's leaving on this particular flight on this particular day. And that was the only chance that they had of actually even knowing where to look. So in the absence of those particular interventions, whether it's through whistleblowers or whether it's through accidental disclosures, their motivations notwithstanding, like in the case of Arthur Fraser, we actually know that a lot of our law enforcement quite simply don't have the capacity to pick up these transactions. Nevertheless, once that happens, what you then have to remember is that what we're dealing with here is the first question of how the money arrived in the country. So what we do know is that the businessman who is now at the center of this says that when he came into the country, he declared the money. Now that's where the problems start, because SARS then gives us a remarkably opaque response to that question. They say, well, he says it did, but we cannot find evidence of that, right? And they leave it at that. And that, unfortunately, isn't particularly useful to anyone, because they should be the type of institution that says, these are the only possible reporting channels. These are the only possible channels of declaration. So if it isn't part of this particular document, then the answer is simple. It was never declared. So you have an individual who explicitly says that I came in, I entered at OR Tambo on a particular day, and that's how the money ended up in Limpopo. So that chain, it's very clear. So for SARS to then say, we simply cannot find evidence of it being done, rather than them saying explicitly, well, clearly it didn't happen, that's where we start seeing the development of these gray areas where people, instead of giving us an explicit answer, simply gravitate towards saying, well, we can't tell you otherwise, but we do see or we do not see that. That's where the problem starts in. The secondary issue, of course, is that because this man clearly did not follow those particular declarations, then an organization like the SAPS and an organization like Home Affairs are not really in a position to even know that this man was, a person of interest. So that's how the money gets into the country. So had somebody alerted any of those institutions, perhaps we wouldn't have been here. But that, unfortunately, is a very common feature of what happens until somebody alerts the authorities, either through whistleblowing or through deals that have gone wrong, or, as we now know, through the political shenanigans that we saw in this particular case.
So, I mean, if we can just touch on that, right? Because you use a very interesting word. You use the word that this was quite an opaque report, right? Similar things have been said about the South African Reserve Bank report. And the underlying kind of question that people are really asking, which I think is quite a serious question, is can we trust the South African Reserve Revenue Services and the South African Reserve Bank, right? Two institutions that have been bulwarks in our democracy, two institutions that, one in particular that really went through the most during the 2010s, but is now fighting back, trying to restore its reputation, two institutions that have really held arguably the country together. Are we really implying at this point, and it's just a question, that these institutions are playing political games at this point? Because it seems like it.
Yeah. So when you speak to these institutions, they would give you precisely the opposite answer. They would say explicitly, we are not playing political games. That's why we're not pulling a trigger based on incomplete information. And as far as they're concerned, they all legitimately can argue that they're operating from a position of incomplete information. Because for the Reserve Bank, for example, the only law that they oversee that affects this particular transaction is a question of exchange control declarations, right? So even if they said, well, actually, the problem is that we want to know how it got into the country, until they interact with those law enforcement agencies that are responsible for interrogating that part of the conversation and then saying, give us the information that we have so that it informs how we assess this transaction, then you essentially have everyone saying, but what if we pull the trigger and we make this conclusion, and then the organization that has absolute authority over that particular input then comes and says something otherwise? We also had the problem of that all of these institutions enjoy autonomy, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But it was in that autonomy where we knew that the gaps were always a risk, in that you could have one institution looking at this transaction from a particular prism, coming up with particular conclusions, and then listening to another institution and then saying, wait, hold on, I'm struggling to reconcile the conclusions that I'm hearing from these two institutions. Now, none of these institutions then sat down and said, guys, let us read our reports and then actually understand whether they speak to each other or whether they should speak to each other. Whether that would have even been allowed is something that I'm not particularly sure of, but that is essentially the crux of the problem here. So what you've seen is that investigations that were conducted using very different instruments of interrogation, using different focus areas, and obviously reaching conclusions based on what those institutions felt was wholly within their mandate. Now, all of them can tell you that, look, had we had access to the legal instrument that interrogates XYZ, in other words, if we as a Reserve Bank, for example, had had the authority to interrogate the tax returns, we could have said, wait, hold on, you have just told us that the transaction is incomplete, but in your tax return, you've declared the transaction is incomplete, we've got a problem. So because they didn't do that, they're simply saying that we can lay out the bullets on the table, but we do not have the authority to actually pull the trigger, because actually, what if one of the bullets is, a placebo on the basis that we do not know what, informed the formation of that bullet? So that's the issue that you've got with this accountability system that is essentially speaking past each other rather than converging towards a similar process.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that these institutions are essentially saying, listen, this is the parameters of our argument and our investigation. What you're trying to get us to do is join this kind of political conclusion, right? And it begs the question, and this is probably my biggest critique of the parliamentary reports and that process of, you pulled the trigger too soon. You could have waited another 6 months, right? And waited for all these other reports to build this political case. But because you pulled that trigger too soon, you're now waiting for all these other reports to become damning. And once they're not damning and they don't align kind of political views and beliefs at that point, it emboldens certain people to say, well, this is a good way to get away with things, right?
No.
Right.
So
we limit Parliament's investigatory power. And
well, very simple. The fundamental problem with the parliamentary process is that they were explicitly told that they could only rely on pre-existing evidence. I think they could only basically do a desktop research based on the submissions that they received from particular individuals, and that was it. So it would have been very difficult for them to hold on to whatever conclusions they formulated on the basis of what they were specifically told to look at, right? So had the ambit been changed to say, wait, hold on, if you guys do this desktop research and you can clearly see that there's gaps in the information that's been provided and that there are clear, obvious omissions here, then you've got the latitude to then interrogate these other agencies and say, we are about to formulate an opinion based on a transaction that involves the type of law that you oversee. Can you give us some insights into what you have discovered or what you're looking into so that we can decide whether to pull the trigger or not? So the parameters of what the parliamentary inquiry or the parliamentary process sought to focus on were determined on day one, and they were quite limiting in nature. And I think, obviously, the greatest problem that emerged from that particular process is that a lot of people tended to conflate its political status with essentially, a judicial or a criminal status. Whatever the report said, it was still going to be a report that was going to be presented to a National Assembly made up of ANC MPs. So the answer was always going to be whatever the ANC decides to vote on, whether to reject or adopt the report. So that was always going to be the ultimate outcome, regardless of what the report said. The utility of the report is that it then gave us insight onto what the key questions ought to have been. And of course, had Parliament said, wait, hold on, the report is damning enough for us to actually elevate it into a process of inquiry and then invite the president to make particular representations, then of course it would have simply then enabled that process to be more open, because the reason it was closed is that it said, only look at what you have in front of you and nothing else. And if you then give us something that tells us that we must open this up, invite witnesses and all of that, that would have been a parliamentary process. That is the step that was not taken simply because the NC decided to vote down the report. They were well within their political right to do so. So whatever the report said, it was still a matter of how many hands vote one way or another.
So this political right is a fascinating topic, right? That we have a majority, therefore, we have the will of the people behind us, 57%. Who are you to tell us what we should or should not do, right? We've been given a mandate by the people. But Ezekiel asks a really good question. This is just a quick reminder. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. So Ezekiel's asked the question here, and it's really on this idea of what is the role of our institutions? And he just asked, there's a whole kind of preamble to it, but the heart of it is putting aside whether Ramaphosa is guilty or not. should we not be concerned about how these institutions, and I assume he means from Parliament to the SARB to SARS, potentially we'll see what the NPA says, Hawke says, but shouldn't we be concerned about how these institutions seem to be used to protect the president, as some have argued? And he just wants to hear your thoughts. Are these institutions being used to protect the president, even if it comes at the expense of citizens? And if I add a little caveat, is that correct? Is that right, in your opinion?
So the first issue here is that, as I was trying to say earlier on, these institutions are specifically trying to avoid playing the political game. So for them, the way they've treated this is that they want to be able to legitimately say that we do not go into the political terrain, we're stuck to the law. So what that means is that they are specifically, and I would say proactively, avoiding looking beyond what the narrowest prescripts of their mandate says to them. And the reason they want to do that is that they want to specifically avoid the accusations that, well, actually, you went into the terrain that was beyond your mandate. So this is something that I believe they're proactively trying to do. The secondary issue is the suspicion that they're now trying to protect the president. I think that suspicion is a consequence of the way in which they've been very, reserved in actually articulating their process flows and their thinking processes so that people can reconcile the conclusions that they reach versus, what we heard in the public domain. The Reserve Bank is obviously the biggest culprit because they refuse to release a report. And what they do is that they then publish a statement whose conclusions are, to the layman, difficult to reconcile with the information as we understood it, right? Now, of course, the Reserve Bank may have had insights to information that is far more superior to what you and I have. They may have had the ability to interrogate people in a manner that you and I have not been able to do so. But what is fatal to their approach is that since they know that the public at large has no access to those insights, and that the public at large has the simple statement that says from this businessman that I bought these things, and as far as I'm concerned, they're mine. Since the public has access to an invoice by Mr. Ndlovu that says, I've received $580,000 on this day for the sale of buffalo, the public says, well, there was a sale of buffalo at a particular point in time. The curiosity is that that is what those individuals are saying. But of course, you've got other people that say, well, of course, there was no transaction to begin with. It was all a sham, right? So the Reserve Bank now comes out and says, well, actually, the transaction was incomplete. We're like, wait, hold on. Is this really a matter of other people having said from day one that there was no transaction to begin with? Because if you are going to say to us that the basis for your conclusions is that the transaction is incomplete, that may well be the reason. It wasn't completed within 30 days, so therefore the trigger for reporting did not materialize at any point in time. But far more fundamental for an organization like the Reserve Bank is a simple question of, hold on, as the institution that is then responsible for overseeing Regulation 6.1, what in your view should be the consequence of a transaction of this nature that has now been pending for 4 years? Are you now telling us that you're comfortable with anyone else putting what may be very, very, flimsy clauses in contracts that then say that transaction is pending for such a long period of time? It is also fatal to their own approach in that, as far as we know, the only document relating to this transaction was an invoice that Ndlovu submitted that simply says, this was the individual, he's here on Christmas Day in 2019, and this is the amount of cash. At no point in time did that particular individual say, this was the underlying contract that then said, these are the 7 or 10 conditions that must be met in order for us to conclude this transaction. Whether the Reserve Bank saw such a contract, we do not know. The fact that they could form a conclusion that based on some contract there were suspensive conditions is again equally fatal to their approach, because we're saying, wait, hold on, at no point in time did the public protector speak about these outstanding conditions. At no point in time did the parliamentary process speak about these outstanding conditions. The South African Revenue Services has said, look, the taxes are compliant, so therefore, where did this condition suddenly materialize from? And even if these conditions exist, does it not then become a responsibility for the Reserve Bank to explain to you and I that, guys, if you do engage in such transactions, yes, there's a 30-day reporting window, unless you've got conditions of a particular nature that then say X, Y, and Z. Because if you do have those particular conditions, well, actually, you can retain that foreign currency for as long as you can. Could be 4 years. You don't have to declare to us. And you can already see the slippery slope that they're getting into. So this process has created many problems for the Reserve Bank in particular, because we now do not know what exactly it is that they want us to understand as a process of oversight in relation to foreign currency.
mean, and you've partially, I think you've answered one of Lungelo's questions that's in the chat about the requirement of whether there's a requirement for a complete sales cycle. And I think you answered that quite well, but I'm going to push back on you again. I mean, the Reserve Bank governor also said that, you know, we understand the limitations that we had. We also understand the questions that it poses. We have a mechanism, I think it's the FCCM, I might be getting the acronym wrong, but we've got FIC, we've got the mechanism to do the investigations, and this team gives the reports to the Hawks. But the prosecution rate of what is given to the Hawks is quite low, right? The South African Reserve Bank is not a prosecuting authority, right? Even asking them to go, let me not say that, but they're not a prosecuting authority. Ideally, they shouldn't be an investigatory authority. That's not their core focus, but they understand there's this challenge. They understand there's the loopholes. Where does the buck fall, right? If these institutions are limited in their mandate because they're not prosecuting authorities, who then should be doing this case? And why I make this point is, you know, in the United States, I'm not a legal expert in South Africa, but I know in the United States, the entire purpose of a RICO case is to essentially say, we don't know if we can pinpoint one particular issue to nail you on, right? But we can essentially go ghost hunting. And we are sure that we're going to stumble upon some bones. And once we stumble upon enough bones, we can then open a RICO case against you. Where does that responsibility ultimately reside? Because that's the question. People want a conclusion to this. So how do we conclude?
Well, according to the Financial Action Task Force, nowhere. Because the reason South Africa got grey listed was precisely because of that particular problem, where institutions like the Reserve Bank, institutions like the Financial Sector Conduct Authority and the Financial Intelligence Center went and argued in front of the FATF that, look, they've done all that they can in order to ensure that there's integrity in the country's financial ecosystem. So they explain the type of laws that they oversee, and they explain the type of oversight and the vigilance that they exercise over the system. And the report came back and said, well, actually, you guys claim that you do all of these things, but what happens after you've done them? And the answer was that we forward it to law enforcement agencies, and that's where everything goes to die, right? So on the basis that there are no follow-up prosecutions relating to issues that get picked up through all of these structures, you've got the problem. So similarly here, for as long as all of these systems, all of this loop, this loop is so dependent on what we now acknowledge to be a very weak prosecutions and law enforcement system, you're always going to end up with these incomplete cases or these imperfect cases, as the Reserve Bank now wants us to use the term, right? So until we actually have a system that then says, 10 days ago, the Financial Intelligence Center sent us this report, this is what we've done with it. 4 or 5 years ago, the Deputy Commissioner of SARS was reported by the Financial Intelligence Center to be receiving ridiculously large amounts of cash into his bank account that was beyond the ambit of what he was earning at SARS. This was reported by the Financial Intelligence Center. Absolutely nothing has happened since then. So you've got multiple cases where all of these other institutions are going to argue that we've actually put a strong case of the laws have been violated, and then we pass it on to those that have the capacity to prosecute, and then we get ghosted, right? So that is the crux of the problem that we have here. So what you would have thought is that last year, when our National Treasury presented what we refer to as the omnibus bill in Parliament, which was essentially a series of 5 different bills that were being rushed in Parliament to be able to say, we don't want to get grey listed, so please pass all these laws into action. The most important part of that was that all of those laws are always going to remain moot and meaningless for as long as law enforcement is not reformed in order to be able to sufficiently respond to these issues. And unfortunately, that still remains the case. And that's why the grey listing happened. What was most surprising and perhaps alarming for a lot of people is that you would have thought the Reserve Bank in particular would have been the one institution at the forefront of saying, whatever it takes to remove the grey listing, we must deal with it. The fact that they've published this statement, the fact that they've gone from a process of retreating from dealing with the elephant in the room by firstly not releasing a report and then saying we're only dealing with one element, is that it has created the impression that, well, even the one institution that went and argued in front of Parliament and went and argued in front of the FATF that they're doing as much as they can to deal with money laundering and illicit money flows. Well, actually, when the litmus test came for them to actually show, how courageous they could be in confronting this, they gave us an answer that says, well, actually, as far as we're concerned, it was a gray area, so therefore there's no crime to be found here. And that was remarkably disappointing.
I mean, this is a really good segue because, as I said, the Reserve Bank has not been built as an institution to be the bulwark and first line of defense for democracy. We have dedicated institutions for that, in particular our Chapter 9 institutions. And there's a question from Lungelo in the chat, which he's put a smiley face here, so I assume Lungelo knows it's a bit of a cheeky question. But the question is, what is the impact of the incumbent public protector's proximity to politics, right, in relation to her decision to exonerate the president, and also given that she was gunning for this job, essentially? This is an institution that in the Bay, and I can say it with my chest, in the dark days of our country, an institution that really shines some lights and really helped this country in immense ways, that is now being degraded in different ways. Do you think there's any validity to that question, or just your thoughts around that question?
So I think that the most curious element of the public protector's approach is that it looked like, when you read the report, it left with the lingering impression that the report said, look, unless there is a specific, very clear, indisputable violation of this particular Ethics Act, we're simply going to say we did not find enough. So again, it felt like it was a retreat from confronting the serious questions about, well, actually, surely once the president was elevated into the deputy presidency, I think you'll remember this, he underwent a very coordinated process of quarantining himself from his business interests. He set up a blind trust. Phuthuma Nhleko took on some of those businesses. So that was based on the very clear understanding that when it comes to taking on executive office, whether as deputy president or as president, you do not want to have any lingering suspicion that you are championing policy frameworks that ultimately benefit your own private business interests. So as far as we know, the president is completely detached and distanced from all of his business interests as we know them, right? So when this story broke, then one of the articles that I wrote, I said is that I found it quite interesting how the president had decided that every other business that is involved in should be put through the blind trust, that he should be distanced from it. And yet this was the one business where he wanted to retain an active involvement. Because I was just curious about what his state of mind would have been to say, no, actually, when it comes to this particular business, I do actually want to retain an active interest. We see pictures of on social media of him attending these auctions, actively participating in it, and then him going to ANC rallies and declaring that, he's a farmer, he trades in buffaloes and all of that. So it's never been very clear to me on what basis did everything else go into a blind trust and this one didn't. And this one is the one that he said that I'm going to keep an active interest in. And of course, that is probably a question of the type of political advice that he gets, which I must admit sometimes leaves one wondering about the wisdom of the advisor that he has, right? So that is a problem that we already have. So when you see the public protector's report that then seeks to say, oh no, the president has no involvement in this at all, I would have expected it to then deliberate further to say, well, actually, the president started off as a businessman. The president went through a process of acknowledging that this particular Ethics Act probably creates tension points. So therefore, that's why he quarantines himself from his businesses. And then you'd have then expected that same report to then interrogate the question of, well, in relation to this particular business, why did he not follow the same approach? I mean, we know that when it came to the business of Shanduga, for example, he wasn't involved there every single day, and yet he still put it through a blind trust. The McDonald's business, same thing, wasn't that their operation, and he still put it through a blind trust. So he seemed to have been aware of the need for these particular structures, with the exception of the farming business. And then the public reporter comes back and says, oh no, actually, as far as we know, he's not really involved in this. I'm like, oh, that sounds to be at odds with his own interpretation of why this particular business must remain within his ambit and within his control. So you see a lot of those examples where, of course, no one can categorically say that the public protector is lying or that the public protector is right. It's yet another instance of, look, until you can show me categorically where this is the line, I'm going to retreat instead of confronting what is an unclear dimension. And that seems to be the issue here. Now, a lot of people are then creating a secondary question of whether she did this because she had an eye on the job. Again, firstly, it's important to deal with the petty semantics. The president cannot appoint the public protector until the National Assembly says so, right? He has absolutely no involvement in the nomination process. He has no involvement in the interview process. On Monday, when the vote is taken, he's not a member of the National Assembly. So if everybody else formed the view that, look, this president has done something wrong and should not be part of this, it is the people that we've elected into the National Assembly that must take that view and say, well, actually, we think this public protector is compromised, so therefore she must not get this job, right? So this idea that, well, because she wanted Ramaphosa to appoint her, she did this, seems to undermine the integrity of the processes in between. And of course, what you would have expected is that all those processes in between, if there was a strong case for saying the only reason you reach these conclusions is because you want this job and you wanted to protect this man, then they had an opportunity to interrogate him. You and I, as the public, had the opportunity to make public comments on the suitability and the integrity of these candidates. And clearly, through all of that, she still emerged as a candidate. She is still not the public protector. National Assembly is well within its rights on Monday to say, wait, hold on. We do think that perhaps the proximity between the ultimate appointing authority and the type of report that you put through creates the type of gray area that we are uncomfortable with. So therefore, let's take it back to the committee. Please give us an alternative candidate. That's still what the system is, right? So whether people then believe that the ANC's caucus, which will probably primarily be responsible for getting across the line on Monday, are themselves complicit in this, miasma, if you want to call it that, this theoretical political proximity thing. Yeah, that's something that we're free to deliberate on. But I wouldn't want to taint, the process by making aspersions that say, oh no, she only produced that report because she wanted the job. This report can be subject to judicial review. And if it turns out that she specifically did that, I think she will be held accountable.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the arguments I've been making for years, that our democracy was never designed for one party to win every single election, because it essentially skews all institutions, but a competitive multi-party democracy allows these contestations to naturally happen. Now, there's two interesting questions in the chat. One I think you've answered about, is the president allowed to have a business whilst they are president? And I think you've covered that, about how he's managed that, except for his game farm. The other question is, essentially, does the president sit above everyone else, right? Can he be wavered from these issues of compliance in one way or another? And I assume
no, absolutely no. There's no debate. The answer is absolutely no.
However, it leads perfectly into the question from Nompumelelo Shabangu. And she asks, and I think it's a fascinating question. It's just different industries, but getting your insights would be interesting. And she says the jewelry industry and traders have recently been pounded by this new rule that they're forcing us to declare and register every piece of jewelry we have, and that we may have that, and that we may have that is 100K or more, right?
Yeah.
And her question is, why does it seem that this rule is picking and choosing? Why is it that certain high value traders get a different experience, whereas the others, especially when they see at these auction trades, that these higher value items don't have the same red tape?
Yeah, well, actually, with that one, there's a bit of a longer background, and I'll try and summarize it. But the bigger background then is that over the past couple of years, in relation to some of the risks that have been identified in how money moves in between the country, there's been a shift towards saying some industries pose a greater risk than others, right? So you can imagine industries, the jewelry industry, for example, the type of trusts that people put together, for example, and the property industry, for example, those clearly pose a great risk of people engaging in transactions of significant amounts of money without actually the ability to interrogate, wait, hold on, how did this person come to be in a position to afford this, right? So those industries have specifically been targeted over the past couple of years for additional compliance burdens. So I empathize with the jewelry industry, but I can understand exactly how they ended up within the radar of law enforcement. And the idea behind those was to say, these particular industries may have actually been complicit in aiding, unwittingly, some of the key money laundering issues that we see. So if somebody comes here in Camps Bay, for example, and buys a property for 40 million Rand, and that person, financial profile does not match that 40 million Rand, does the property agent have the right to say, no, I cannot sell this to you because I don't know where your money came from? Some property agents don't believe that. They're like, look, he's paid the 40 million, the sale price is 40 million, so I'm getting up in all of that, right? So that extra sense of vigilance is actually being imposed on these particular industries in order to enable law enforcement to say, wait, hold on, You sold the property to this person for 40 million. Please show us how you actually interrogated this person's capacity and ability to pay before you reconciled yourself to the fact that this was not a criminal transaction, right? Jewelry industry, same thing, because clearly the type of items that they trade in are high value items. And a lot of people probably do tend to engage in cash. I don't think people buy wedding rings or engagement rings and then pay for 20 years for it because the marriage might not last that long. So that's probably how
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know.
You know, yeah, these things happen. So I think that's how that industry unfortunately ended up within that particular ambit. But also on the question that you raised earlier on, or whether we've got some presidential immunities unique to the president in relation to the application of the law, there is no such thing. And there definitely isn't such a thing in relation to exchange control regulations.
Okay, so we've come to the conclusion that the parliamentary report was limited. We've come to the conclusion that SARS was limited in its scope as well. We've come to the conclusion that public protector was limited as well. And we've come to the conclusion that the South African Reserve Bank was limited and timid. I think they've been the most timid of all of them. The next report that we're waiting on, a report or investigation, is from the Hawks, right? This is the one I've been telling my team for a while of. All these other reports, I can kind of predict what will happen, and it's exactly what happened. The Hawks report is the only one that I can't predict because of the prosecutorial latitude that they have. Right, they're not limited to interpreting the law in this particular case because that's our ambit. So the question I do you have any hope or faith in the Hawks report? Do you think, what are the types of findings that you think this investigation will bring up that they'll take forward to the NPA?
Well, the first thing is that when you say, do we have any hope in the report that's looming? Well, we thought that the report from the Reserve Bank, didn't we? And look at how that turned out, right? So it's also quite difficult to predict how much information these institutions are going to provide in order to explain the basis for their decision making. And I think the Hawks aren't famous for the type of reports that they put together because they simply say, look, we've done the investigation, and the investigation that we've done is obviously going to be used to build a case that we think is prosecutable. Very key elements of that investigation will not be disclosed in advance because we do not want to bolster the capacity of those implicated to, lodge a defense. So you may end up with the Hawks even being less transparent than the Reserve Bank on the basis of saying, well, actually wait until we take it to court. So therefore, we'll then give you the entire Pandora's box. So that's the one possibility that you have there. But I think perhaps what makes their process different is, as you said, they've got a much more open mandate. They've got much wider latitude. That's the first issue. The secondary issue is that I need to caution against this expectation that one institution will suddenly identify the president as the person guilty of an offense, right? The reality here is that if you go to what the Reserve Bank and SARS did, for example, SARS would have had to distinguish between the president as an individual and the farm as an operational entity. The buffaloes are not in the president's own name, they're in the farm's name, right? So when SARS says that the taxes are compliant here, if they had to give us the president's tax return, the buffaloes are nowhere to be seen in the president's tax return because they belong to a farm. So all the issues relating to the buffaloes would have been in the farm. The only compliance angle is a question of, does the farm then generate dividends that can go into the president's tax return in his capacity as the owner of the farm? And if the farm says, yes, these are the dividends, and he says, yes, I declared them, then the president walks off scot-free in relation to SARS. So that's the biggest risk that we have here. We have to be able to try and figure out exactly what these institutions are looking at, right? The farm itself is the one that then has the responsibility of saying, well, we traded with Mr. Mustafa, and when we traded with him, the law said that we must declare this transaction within 30 days, but actually we didn't do it within 30 days because as far as we're concerned, the transaction was pending. Again, those are the issues that the president will legitimately say, oh no, the farm did that, I didn't. My interest in the farm, which is what the public protector also reconciles with, is that I just happen to be the owner. And as the owner, I receive a dividend at the end of the year. I receive some particular return at the end of the year. Because remember, the crux of the public protector's assessment was the fact that, no, he's merely an owner, is not an operator of this particular farm, right? So even if SARS had to publish its reports, you may find that they create this very important distinction between the president and the farm. And then they say, well, actually, both of them are compliant on the basis that they informed us about the transaction. It's also important to know that as far as SARS is concerned, the moment money arrives in your account based on a transaction that's happening or not happening, as long as you declare it, they will say you complied. It's not up to them to say, no, actually the transaction must be completed in order for you to be compliant. They say, no, simply because you told us that a transaction is happening, whether the transaction is multi-year or multi-seasonal, that meets the compliance burden of SARS. So that's the problem that you have here. Similarly, when it comes to the Reserve Bank, when we eventually dig up that report will make a very clear distinction between, even if the transaction had been perfected, whatever that means, the person who had the duty and the responsibility to declare the currency is the one who would have been unconditionally entitled to the currency, in other words, the farm, right? Once the farm becomes unconditionally entitled to the currency, it triggers those reporting obligations. The farm, whatever its financial reporting cycle is, will then say, at the end of the year, this is the profit or the loss that we've made, and this is how much we're then passing on to our owner in the form of a dividend, right? So those processes are unfortunately going to annoy a lot of people, but those are the processes as they work. So if we see all of these reports, they are going to firstly create a very clear distinction between the president, the individual, and the farm, the institution. And the farm is the one that's more likely to be found at fault rather than the president. The wisdom of him overseeing an entity where money randomly gets hidden in couches and safes, that's a secondary issue altogether that unfortunately is not within the ambit of law enforcement agencies. We could use words like dumb, stupid, weird, ill-advised, but that's not really going to be the type of thing that gets him out of office.
So, I mean, we've got a couple questions, but we're going to run out of time very quickly. What happens, and I'll take the questions down. So this is a quick one. So a quick answer to this. What would it take to clear the president? Right? Everything that you've just explained said, you know, you could really pin this on the companies, right? And the president could just be seen as foolish activity, but not illegal activity. Or you have foolish employees, but not anything illegal happening. What do you think would placate the public? What would essentially end, as someone said in the earlier question, what would end this Phala Phala saga to an extent?
So far, the president's approach has been, I can't talk to you because it's being investigated. At some point in time, all the investigations will end. And I think what will help the president's image in the public's eye is a very clear explanation of what he understands to have been the issues underpinning this. The fact that the money was stolen, trust me, very few people feel any sense of empathy for him. Look, he had $580,000 stolen and he clearly didn't seem to care. I mean, he just moved on. So I don't think the president is bankrupt on that basis. So no one's going to feel any sense of empathy for that. But I think what is quite important is once he has reconciled with all of these reports, because he's the head of state, he then has the duty to then say, look, this has been a learning lesson. This is what we've identified are the key issues in relation to the oversight of particular financial flows. And as the president who actually wants this country to be governed properly, I'm going to champion a process that says, look, this is how we close all these particular loopholes, right? And I think that will be important because right now, the impression that we all have is to say, guys, whatever you do, if you want to move currency around without having to declare it to the Reserve Bank, just create a condition. And you don't have to document this condition anywhere because the president and his people didn't, and yet SARS believed that the conditions were there. So it's created the wrong impression about what can and cannot be done. And I don't think it's in the interest of the country to actually have that as a lingering impression of this Phala Phala saga. So that's the first part. And I think the second part is the president still has to explain exactly how every other business went into a blind trust except this one. Because when you look at that, I'm like, oh, what was it about this particular business? Was it because you wanted to be operationally involved? Because if that's the answer, then that's at odds with what the public protector
with the ethical conduct. Yeah,
exactly. So that for me remains the point of contention. But he's going to wait for all the reports to be finalized. And if he decides to say, look, after reconciling all of these events, I think these are the lessons for the nation at large. I think that is the lessons for me and my business at large. So therefore, this is where we go forward.
I mean, and even if that does happen, there's a history of presidents essentially putting on Stalingrad tactics and saying, until someone says I am actually guilty, I'm not going anywhere. Now, there's two really long comments. I wouldn't call them questions, but they're quite long comments in the chat. One is from Andre. So he said quite a lot, but there's one aspect that I think kind of needs some conversation. And it's about, how the president hasn't resigned is now beyond him. And he kind of gives his rationale earlier on. And he says he's really just compromised, right? And that the entire South African economy has been manipulated. The fruits of our people and their hard work has almost been completely siphoned off out of the country. He's also made comments that siphoned off the continent. And it's exactly because of businesses like Phala Phala in particular, the saga. Now, do you think this is, and we've talked about the grey listing earlier, we've talked about the weaknesses of our exchange controls. The question is this a particular representation of certain people in the country, that this is how they deal with money, and we are just unbeknownst to it? Or is this an endemic attack on the country?
No, I do think that the president definitely did not design the template. This is clearly reflective of practices that happen in particular sectors of the economy, in particular, value chains in the economy. And the fact that, foreigners had the presence of mind to say, oh no, I'm just gonna go to South Africa with $580,000 in my briefcase, and I'll just walk through the airport and I'll end up at anyone's farm, which just happened to be the president's farm in this case, and I'll buy these things. It simply means that there's clearly an existing practice. I don't think that this gentleman was an exception, the one person who sat somewhere in Dubai and said, actually, what if I just go and do this in the South Africa's borders without having any insights onto whether it's possible or whether it's even practical? So it clearly isn't an isolated issue. This is reflective of what people of that particular economic cluster tend to do. And it will be important for us to then figure out a way of how to identify these things and how to actually deal with them decisively. And as I said earlier on, our biggest problem is that not only in this case, the Phala Phala case, but also in the case that I mentioned earlier on of the $630,700, a lot of it depended on the ability, it wasn't through the capacity of law enforcement agencies. It wasn't through SARS's own investigation or the Reserve Bank's vigilance that we knew about these things. It was simply because people who knew about it then decided to alert these particular agencies. And until these agencies have got the instruments or the resources to be able to pick up these transactions on a more frequent, on a more regular basis, without having to rely on the benevolence of others who may have ulterior motives and who may not tell us about everything, we clearly have a broken system.
So, I mean, this broken system and the potential solution that I know you're not suggesting, so I'm definitely putting words in your mouth, and because I'm going to have the last say, I can do this. Well, we're really asking turkeys to vote for Christmas, right? That's really what we're doing. The only individuals that can expand the laws, that can expand the powers, that can give these institutions greater leeway would be our parliament and our politicians, right? But if they're also part of the systemic problem, regardless of how many people want to stand on a platform and say, we are amongst the people, we trust in you. If we don't have faith that there's a competitive democracy, right, then all of this is almost for naught. And now, Kaya, we are out of time. I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of Defend Our Democracy. I know there's a ton of questions and they keep coming in. So hopefully we can answer that. Maybe we'll forward you the comments in one way or another. If you have the time, you can email responses. We can also respond in different ways. But I want to say a huge thank you to you for taking out your time today, for really being quite insightful. I hate to say it, but you've taught me a few things, which is always an annoying thing to say to you, but you've taught me a few things today, and I just want to say thank you on behalf of DOD. To everyone in the room who are not aware, the Defend Our Democracy movement is now actively opening up its affiliation process. We function as not just a convening space for conversations like this, but a convening space for civil society, public organizations, as well as individuals, to essentially say, how do we come together to ask these questions about our public representatives? How do we come together to ask questions about how do we hold the government accountable, and how do we ensure that they are responding to the people on the ground? And part of this affiliation process is really joining this broader community that we're building, from large blue chip civil society all the way to grassroots organizations. And the basic idea behind it is ensuring that we create a critical mass of organizations that essentially say enough's enough, right? We can't do it by ourselves. We can't fight in our own corners. I was telling someone yesterday that civil society is trying to put out fires across the country. And I think there's a time for us to essentially say, can we create a fire department that coordinates our activities? and we want you to be part of this movement. So if we have the time, please check out our website or email Zakira for those who have our email. Get in touch with us on our social media, and we'll show you how to affiliate with DoD and join this growing community that we're building. And I just want to say once again, thank you everyone for attending today. It was a fantastic turnout. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, and they really started rolling in towards the end. But I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon and you join us at our next discussion. Thank you so much and goodbye.